Couple of seats down here, if anyone's looking for them. My name's David McIlwraith. I'm a member of the Socialist Project and the Cultural Committee of the Socialist Project, and I want to welcome everyone here tonight. I can't see you, but as long as I can see my notes. I want to welcome everyone to the Socialist Project Cultural Committee's General Strike Cabaret 1919. It's a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike. And I want to start this evening by acknowledging that the land we are gathered on is the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. I also want to acknowledge that saying these words does not erase the historic wrongs, the racism, and the colonial greed that made it necessary for us to use these words today. Tonight's cabaret is sponsored by the Cultural Committee of the Socialist Project. The Socialist Project is a Toronto-based organization of like-minded people, much like yourselves, who support and encourage and work for the rebuilding of the socialist left in Canada and around the world. We believe that capitalism in all its forms, and certainly in its neoliberal iteration, has brought much of the world to a perilous state of inequality and injustice and to the brink of ecological disaster. In opposition to that, the Cultural Committee of the Socialist Project presents arts events, like tonight's cabaret, to forward the goals of equality, fairness, and social justice. Antonio Gramsci wrote that political struggle does not just happen in legislatures or at large gatherings in public squares, but also in the stories we tell, the language we use, and the images we create. So we encourage you to join us in our future endeavors, of course as part of our audience, but also, should you be interested, as members of our committee. At the table by the door, you can find information on the Socialist Project and all of its committees. There's also a petition we'd like you to sign demanding that the Keele Street 41 bus be put on the 10-minute network. And you can also check out our very excellent Socialist Project website for more information. I also want to acknowledge our partners in tonight's celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike, Mayworks, and the Toronto Workers' History Project. We are equally grateful to both fine organizations for their contributions and to the Center for Social Justice for helping to make tonight possible. Thank you. You know, someone told me this week that you can't have a cabaret without humor. The problem is, I don't actually approve of political jokes. I've seen too many of them get elected. Okay. Since you insist, one more joke. So, Doug Ford walks into a bar and lowers it. Okay, that's it for the jokes. Now, I'm going to ask my friend Leo Panitch to come up and tell you a bit about the event 100 years ago that we celebrate tonight with our cabaret. Leo's the best person to tell you about the Winnipeg General Strike because he was actually there. Okay, he wasn't there 100 years ago, but he was in Winnipeg this past weekend, participating in several events celebrating the 100th anniversary of the biggest labor action in Canadian history. Leo Panitch on the Winnipeg General Strike.
Well, 100 years ago tomorrow morning, the telephone operators known as the call girls jumped the gun and went on strike a few hours before the strike had actually been called. It was called for 11 a.m. They went to work at 7, turned right around and came out. The strike had been called, of course, by primarily male unions, metal workers, The construction workers, the bosses had refused to negotiate with them in that spring, and workers were balloted by the Winnipeg Trades and Labor Council in every union in the city to see whether they should come out in a sympathy strike. And they overwhelmingly voted by almost 9,000 to 500. I think the most overwhelming vote was the sleeping car porters union, which, since I was a sleeping car, I'm a porter to put myself through university, I'm especially proud of. They voted by 56 to 2 to go out on strike. But it wasn't, of course, only organized workers who went out on strike. They were joined by some 9,000 unorganized workers, bringing the total, or more, some 20,000 unorganized workers, bringing the total to 30,000 workers. And when you take account of their families, half of Winnipeg was on the strike. This included firemen. The police refused to sign a pledge that they would be anti-union. It lasted for 6 weeks until it was broken by the Royal Mounted, the RCMP on the insistence of the federal government. 1919 was not only a Winnipeg year of revolt. Strikes were common right across the country. Greg Keeley did a marvelous article on this in the 1983 Labour Le Travail. Nor were they sympathy strikes with Winnipeg by any means entirely. They were strikes around the same issues, reaching out across the broadest spectrum of the working class from one end of the country to another. And they had been building. The reason that so many people came out in general strikes in 1919 was because in 1918 there had been a series of sympathy strikes which had proved highly successful. Firemen in Alberta, municipal workers, and those sympathy strikes, having succeeded in 1918, gave people courage. The first signal of an event in North America, it only lasted 5 days, was the famous Seattle General Strike. But that was really a small token of revolt compared to what happened not only in Winnipeg, but across the whole country that year. How did this happen? It was really a product of some 40 years of class formation, going back to the 1880s and the militancy that was shown in the mid-1880s. Workers were recognizing themselves. It wasn't only a matter of craft unions beginning to move towards the one big union, which was, of course, a crucial element in the Winnipeg General Strike, as particular unions were coming together influenced by the IWW, and this was the beginnings of the industrial unionism we saw in the 1930s. It wasn't only a matter of that. It was people, whether they were organized or not organized, beginning to understand that they were part of a class struggle in the broadest possible sense. People were recognizing each other as workers. We're recognizing the economic, social, and political significance of being workers. Seamstresses were recognizing they were in the same class as metal workers, and indeed, the seamstresses at the T. Eaton Company walked out 100 years ago tomorrow, and as they did so, their foreman took their punch cards, ripped them up, and threw them on the floor so as to indicate they'd never come back to work, and of course, many of them never did. Most of them never did. To be a worker increasingly meant that you were, in defining yourself as a worker, making a statement that had economic, political, and social significance. I've just read recently a translation of a manuscript written in 1931 by someone who participated in the strike, the uncle of Meyer Brownstone, who many of you will know, was born in Winnipeg, became president of Oxfam Canada, the most radical president Oxfam ever had, engaged in tremendous solidarity activity with the Central American peasants and workers in the 1980s. and was, of course, one of the key civil servants in the first socialist government of Canada, the CCF, in the 1940s and through the 50s. Meyer recently translated a manuscript that was found that his uncle had written in 1931, written in Yiddish, on the Great Western Strike. And there is a passage in it, which if we have time later, I'll read, which describes the egg candlers. They're the people who hold an egg up behind a candle to see whether it's fit for human consumption or for further gestation. And there's a remarkable speech by one of these workers saying, we're not organized, but we recognize that we are part of the same class as those who are out, and insist that they walk out on May 15th. Just finally, what were they striking for? Of course, a lot of people at the time, and a lot of historians since, have said they were striking for better wages, they were striking for collective bargaining rights, they were striking for the right to strike. And in that, they didn't win. Others argue that what they were striking for, and certainly you heard this from the strikers themselves, they were striking for an end to capitalism. They were striking for an end to exploitation. They were striking for socialism. And many of them, of course, were highly influenced by Marxist parties, like the Socialist Party and the Social Democratic Federation in that period. These two are often posed as alternatives. You're either for this or for that. In fact, at the time, the impression that the working class had as it went out on strike was that it probably was not possible to win the reforms they were asking for within the framework of capitalism. It was only as those subsequent reforms were won, partly because of the mobilizations that we're talking about, that it was thought for a period that you could have these reforms in a stable way within capitalism, although things were given up. In order to get the right to collectively bargain and the right to strike, the law took away sympathy strikes. It was illegal to engage in them. In order to have collective bargaining rights established in legislation, workers had to give notice through their unions long in advance of going on strike that they were going to go on strike. Of course, giving their employer enormous advantages to prepare for it, to stockpile, to attempt to persuade the community that this was a strike against the community's interests. So things were lost by virtue of these reforms. We now today are standing in a situation in the early 21st century where it is increasingly clear that in order to hold on even to those reforms, we need to go beyond capitalism. And that is the same sense that the workers who were out on strike after World War I had. In that sense, we're not just looking back, we're looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leo. You don't look a day over 95. Tonight we have music, poetry, theater, and to get us started musically tonight, another of our members will perform two songs for us. One many of you know, and the other you may not know, because Honey has adapted it especially for us tonight. Honey Novick.
What an honor to be here in tribute to people who work. Workers of the world unite, exactly. So you all should have a piece of paper with my adaptation of Joe Hill. Please join me in singing this unofficial anthem. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. In Salt Lake, Joe says says I to him, standing by my bed, they framed you on a murder charge. Says Joe, but I ain't dead. Says Joe, but I ain't dead. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They killed you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man. Says Joe, I didn't die. Says Joe, I didn't die. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, what they could never do. Let me hear that again. Went on to organize, and Joe Hill ain't dead. Joe Hill ain't never died. Where working people defend their rights, Joe Hill is by their side. Joe Hill is by their side. From Oshawa to the BC coast, in every mine and mill, where workers stand up for their rights, that's where you'll find Joe Hill. That's where you'll find Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. Special thanks to Joe Hill. Woo. Yep, okay, so this song, if you've heard it, I thank you. If you haven't, it's my prayer. May the work that I have done speak for me. May the work that I have done speak for me. If I should fall short of my goals, someone else will take a hold, and the work that I have done will speak for me. If you feel like singing with me, please do. May the marches I've been on speak for me. May the marches I've been on speak for me. If I should fall short of my goals, someone else will take a hold, and the marches that I've been on will speak for me. May the friends that I have made speak for me. May the friends that I have made speak for me. If I should fall short of my goals, someone else will take a hold, and the friends that I have made will speak for me. May the work that I have done speak for me. May the work that I have done speak for me. If I should fall short of my goals, someone else will take a hold, and the work that I have done will speak for me. Speak for me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, honey. Now we have the great pleasure of hearing poetry also written especially for this occasion. 2 pieces by 2 of the best poets and best known poets in the country. I could tell you about the revolutionary nature of their writing, but their work speaks for itself. Please welcome Giovanna Riccio and George Elliott Clarke. Giovanna will come up first.
Where are my red stockings? Yes.
Whoa, right up here. I can't see anybody good. Hi, geez, look at this crowd here, all to celebrate workers. Such a long time since I've seen that. I want to say that as a retired teacher, I was on strike twice during Days of Action. And with Doug Ford, I think we need that all over again right now. Yeah, I tell young people all the time right now, with all this precarious work stuff, what they need to do now is strike for a living wage as well. Right. Anyway, so I've written a poem for this evening, and what I was digging for was the women that were involved in the General Strike. They're not very visible in books or photographs. They are there, though. So I've written a poem called Helen Armstrong, and the switchboard operators were called Hello Girls, not Call Girls. Sorry, Leo. Anyway, so it was Helen Armstrong, Hello Girls, and Hellions of the Winnipeg General Strike. So I use the word girls in the poem, of course, because it references that period. They were mostly called girls. And I use the word strikelets because it was a tongue-in-cheek term used among the strikers. And I use the word pétroleuse, which is a French for incendiary, referencing the women of the Paris Commune. Set that red gilded spring in stone, a monument born out of the post-war rumble in a year when Winnipeg's promised spring of cherry blossoms and tenderness faded to a mere mirage. Instead, a red scare rifled breezes, liberty on the run, barred and blood-smeared, while cabinet ministers flew cover for bigwigs, gutting workers' wallets, giving justice the cold shoulder. Carve out a phantom rose of the Luxembourg variety. Helen Armstrong vanished from history, but there, standing left of that blindfolded sellout, there, surveying the one-legged hero, limping in shell-shocked bread lines, the withered mother willing her wing-torn child to fly. Write the famous 10 to a truth-telling 11, for that rabble-rousing woman poked holes in the unseeing lady's crooked scales. Helming the Women's Labor League, her saber tongue once jabbed colonels, drafting proletarian blood for capital's war treasury. Her labor temple preached union. An agitating angel, she incited the bread and cake girls to organize and match, blow for blow, the masters' union clout guised in the stock exchange, banks, and bootlicker Ministry of Justice. Then, as one body, pastry and candy makers cooked up a sweeter deal from the manna-hoarding Canada Bread Company. And a year before the 1919 uprising, Helen wrangled with politicos over women's minimum wage, wangled victory for Manitoba femmes, always pushed girls to school themselves in the licit poetry of equal rights. The only female delegate to the Trades and Labor Council, she demanded TLC for iron workers chained to long shifts and short shrift, for bone-chilled vets rattling a St. Vitus dance on park benches, and raw-boned women nailed to the night. As soapbox pugilist, Helen boxed the ears of boomtown tycoons, exposed their dark side of Brickley slums, aching for equal distribution of sun, air,
and rain. She summoned a good earth, sprouting loaves purged of crescentwood weevils and pinstripes. The plutocrats dubbed her a female Bolshevik as they sipped blood behind barred windows and iron gates. Their hard-boiled tickers bolted against sharing the dough, with bricklayers and welders sick of seeing each day end in the red. Looking to hammer out a living wage and round May Day, building and metal workers walked, looking to hammer out a living wage instead of buying threadbare cliches about the high cost of business. But high life moguls dicker, offer only stale buns, day-old rhetoric. If there's clout in dollars, there's moxie in numbers, says the Central Committee. Seeing one big union as more than a pipe dream, they call a general strike. First to hearken, Helen's progeny. The Hello Girls answered that May Day call. 500 golden-tongued switchboard operators connecting the city's business with number please grace, spied voices flashing crimson. Silencing the boss's yes sir, no sir mic, they warmed all heart to a sympathy strike. Sundered power's umbilical cord from the boss's reach, repainted themselves as liberty leading the people, beauty and guts rewiring double talk, diverting speech. And lickety-split strikelets gushed a scarlet tide out of sweatshops, restaurants, hotels, and offices. For shirt makers, cleaners, candy makers, clerks had more cause to quarrel the gender shortchange and gamble to turf Big Daddy's life sentence of daughter, wife, and mother, condemned to pussyfoot and soft shoe, shackled to manly moolah, playing second fiddle to the bogus family wage. And because women feed the world essential fuel, Helen and entourage set up the Labor Cafe. Not the usual fare, women cook and men eat food kitchen either. No, but one dishing out liberating victuals, so no girl need want, no boy either. And when double-crossers like scabby society ladies and bourgeois daughters or single mothers bribed by salary hikes spurned the picket line, vexed sisters became hellions of head-on harassment, stoning retail turncoats skulking to stores and buses, like the women of Weston and Brooklands chasing down backstabbing delivery trucks, ditching one lorry, smashing wheels, mangling scabby merchandise. True petroleurs, they put the fear of God in saboteurs and cops sent to quell Virago fire. Labeled Bolsheviks, anarchists, aliens, imprisoned, maligned, and loved, the women of 1919, though mere footnotes down at the heels, lurk in margins of books ruled by men. Moonlighting in blanks between words, struggling to feed families, marching, organizing, or mourning that bloody Saturday, they earned a visible voice, rising and blooming in bread and roses, wanting vital ink, to dovetail in heroic couplets and embody Winnipeg's striking epic.
Thank you, Giovanna. That was as stunning and revolutionary as I expected it to be. Now I'll ask George Elliott Clarke to take the microphone.
What an honor it is to be here tonight and to participate in this great event and to add to this celebration of a significant moment, a great moment in labor history, in the history of liberation in this country, which remains, of course, unfinished, undone. Thinking about Winnipeg, I've always been struck by the fact that the Golden Boy icon, which sits atop the Manitoba legislature, is a copy of the exact statue which sits atop a pole at the Place de Bastille in Paris. So there's always been a kind of revolutionary connection between Paris and Winnipeg in many ways. That's one of the little things I touched on in this poem, which I call, it's the first time I've read it. I just wrote it, so here it is. To vote yes always for the Winnipeg General Strike. Prologue. Gussied up moneybags, penny-pinching misers and gimlet-eyed moneylenders, the pinstripe suit vampires and happy hour cannibals, the well-dressed and sulky prudes, the scumbag molochs, plumped up parasites, plutocrats, whose bureaucracy renders democracy bankrupt kleptocracy, where workers are monetized. Sweat's worth gold, but sweat never overpowers gold, never frustrates the omnipotence of gold, where workers hoard ale and bosses hoard gold, where landlords hound workers to cough up dough and won't be buffaloed, can't be appeased, where VIP sphincters fart excuses, such muck to mull over, so mouthfuls as personages talk trash and write garbage, spit out bullshit and write up filth and ink a lot of dirt, to back war profiteers who count corpses, to back conspirators fixing prices behind boardrooms outdoors, loblaws, to back laws that frame workers as fresh serfs, not citizens, more like cannon fodder than consumers, and to back the preachers who tell the poor the word of God is bread enough, to feast on prayers, become well fed on thou shalt nots, well versed in black-robed cant, that lyrical Latinate patina, bamboozling, sidelining, maligning, casting the downtrodden as slobs, crooks, drunks, addicts, hobos, having only themselves to blame, being so unfriendable, being so unlettered, who need accept insistently sour lectures, the animalish, crude grunts of lawyerly gangsters, those who parade as legislators and whose laws foster prejudices, invent outlaws, each perceptibly a bottom feeder, big cigars in the big mouths and big heads, the bastards, lisping poisonously, next adding claptrap, then next utter bullshit. The pure pollution, plain cyanide of the supply and demand of meatless soup and saltless gruel of wine, gone vinegar so poor souls chew, fried cabbage, boiled cabbage, roots, chestnuts, beans, fibrous rubbish, porridge, fried potatoes, boiled potatoes, not else. Fiends constitute the state, who institute destitution, whose wheeling dealing is prostitution, laissez-faire predators, debauched, sewage, stuffed brains, assholes and schmucks, all as durable as hard, cold, old cash, soundly invested in blue chips, stocks, bonds. The bourgeois state is the workers' prison. It pits the well-heeled against the sans-culotte, the bare-assed, whose toggery is ripped rags. Here, capital inks the laws and cuts the checks for politicals, and all working class efforts to better their lives, to evolve beyond the struggle to breathe and eat seem tantamount to launching a civil war. Winnipeg, May, June 1919. Revolutionary she always was, Winnipeg, the prairie's guilt capital. The golden boy capping the provincial parliament mirrors Paris's Bastille statuary. While Louis Riel's Métis rebel revolted so unstoppably versus John A. Macdonald, they founded Manitoba. But the next rebellion got put down while Riel got hanged, but no one could deny the Paris Commune brought home. The example that 1870 set for the prairie Paris, the Bastille, the rebellion, the commune, foretelling the next civil war between bosses and employees, the combat dividing Crescentwood Mansions and North End hovels, the grain exchange and Vulcan Iron facing down plebes, wanting one big union, no more waffling about wobblies, and enough dough to have enough daily bread, and the state to not side with dollars always, to not be swayed by the full weight of gold or gold turned lead gone ferocious, gone to bullets, and to grant the returned men, the veterans, reprieve from imperialist jackals, their suspect accretion of war booty, who just shipped 5,000 Canuck Marines to Vladivostok, Russia to put down Lenin, the Bolshevik Revolution. Capital so murderous and gruesome, no more are syndicates vindicated. The Winnipeg workers will strike against the rich folks' Reich, will strike down their thieving, strike against this Gothic dystopia. Suddenly, the telephones lose perfume. The hello girls are warbling Niet, plugs pulled. Milk carts and bread carts retire their horses until the strike committee lets them clock foodstuffs from door to door to keep households nourished because half the addresses house a striker. Now firefighters light cigarettes. Streetcar drivers ride bikes. Mailmen become singing messengers. Cooks desert kitchens. Waiters toss away their aprons. Barbers set down their clippers. Railway men stay home. Suddenly there's no mail, no telegrams, no streetcars, no taxis, no newspapers. 30,000 Winnipeggers are on strike. It's the Paris Commune. It's a prelude to Paris in May 1968. It's an almost revolution that sparks sympathy strikes across the Dominion. Now cometh Andrews into the picture, and his Citizens Committee of 1,000, a bunch of tycoons and grifters who fired the police force who wouldn't fire on strikers, and deputized goons, frank thugs as special constables, gangbangers brought to bash heads with baseball bats, bring on drums, bugles, brandish guns, bring on bloodshed, yells. Lewis machine guns are shipped in, sights set, paraded about, aimed from the opera house just in case, are not used but are there. Andrew's yellow-bellied, jaundiced yellow press shouts dank, dingy lies, damns the strikers as Bolsheviks. The federal justice minister is warned that the strike could spread. Birth a Canuck Soviet, and Andrews cartoons the strike leaders as seditious conspirators who must be with gusto, handcuffed, imprisoned, and fast deported. The strike leaders, though, weaken their own support by grumbling at the diverse exodus out of Europe, shipping Jew and German and Ukrainian and Pole and Britain to Winnipeg threatens returned men's jobs. But labor's vilifying of migrants strengthens Andrews, who claims the strike leaders themselves are alien scum, deserving exile to be kicked out of Canada. Soon his de facto provisional state, whose only good is fertile defecate, sees 10 strike leaders cuffed and charged and caged while federales occupy the streets. When strikers congregated to protest oppression, the Northwest Mounted Police rampage trampled struck as if medieval inquisitors or as if pursuing Riel, forerunner radical, his ghost risen incarnate at St. Boniface, and the cops slew 2 strikers, right stone dead, and bullied and clobbered and shackled some dozens, so that the strike stymied, stalled, stilled. But diplomacy must fail against death. To have won would have meant non-stop ruction. Wisdom is perpetual consciousness of history. So history is always in the present tense and the first person. So history demands that we extend the general strike. If utopia is true equality of citizens, once we strike down the banker state, once we complete what Winnipeg began.